I will let Deepa go first as somebody who's read the book. And I would personally like to know what she has to say, and then I'll step in.
It's really an honor to be here with Rita Kothari and Shabnam Virmani. Shabnam Virmani is someone whom I've known for a decade or so now because of her work with Kabir and that extraordinary festival that she put up in Bangalore in 2010. And how she's touched our lives with Kabir is probably not easy to put in words. So I'm very happy to share the stage with her, and also Rita Kothari, who I knew before I met her. I met her very recently, but I'm really awestruck by the range of this book. And I was, as I was telling her a while ago, that it's one just has to agree with her and can ask her nothing, because that's the kind of ground that the book covers, about translation, about knowledge, about experience, about literature. So I'm very curious that how did you kind of decide that you were going to write a book such as this?
Yeah, thanks Deepa for that question. This book, I think, just existed pretty much in its entirety inside me. And when I look back at various other books I've written in the past, they involved in some sense, sometimes being haunted by a certain idea and then undertaking research, going into the field or wherever else it involved, interviewing people, doing ethnography, working out in some sense, research questions. But this particular book, I think, came out of some other state altogether. It came out of being at a stage of life where I think some of the most fundamental questions of life, which is about who we are, why we do what we do, what relations matter to us, where do we want to go, whether we have a meaningful existence at all, where do we have that meaningful existence. Some of these questions I felt a tad more settled with them. It's not that I'm saying I have answers, but at least I now know what those questions are, and I'm happy to stay with them as unanswered questions.
Deepa asked me a question, how did I come to write this book? Because it is a very different book from the previous ones that I've written. And also it's a book that actually engages with a lot of critique of what we consider as knowledge, what we consider as legitimate knowledge. What are some of the constituencies of study, and we don't think of that as knowledge. And I ask many of these questions in the context of teaching literature, but also these questions I ask of academia. I ask this question of intellectuals, that why is it that our knowledge leaves out so many people? And that sometimes it comes in shapes and forms and languages that are so disembodied from our own experience. So when Deepa was asking me, how did I come to write this book? I was saying that it's not something I could have written in my younger days. I mean, it had to come at a particular time. I've been in the teaching profession now for 30 years. And I spent the first about 17 to 18 years in a liberal arts college in Ahmedabad, a Jesuit college. And there was a certain way by which teaching English to Dalit students, then to tribal students, then to very well-heeled upper-class students who would go on to do graduate studies elsewhere, English performed different kinds of symbolic and discursive roles in that particular context. And then I went to a management institution where I was teaching again courses that I teach, which had to do with literature, cinema, narratives, cultural history. And every now and then I would encounter a question by a student saying, well, I work in the industry. Tell me, how is this knowledge going to be useful to me? So these questions of what is the quote unquote utility of knowledge, or a question that what How does one language perform these different functions for different people? Or the fact that earlier I taught as a temporary lecturer in a college which is in the old part of Ahmedabad city, which had Dalit and Muslim students, and I was teaching English literature in Gujarati. And when I look at all these various contexts, I kind of think that there is a certain kind of dissonance. There is a certain dissonance in the lives we live and in the professions we pursue. There is dissonance in the fact that we carry in our psychic lives many languages, but they are not the ones that beckoned us to their world. Instead, we went to the English language, and very often we carry within us what I call an uneasy translation between these other languages which we did not think had a future for us, and whereas we function with the English language, and sometimes these various kinds of situations exist in a slightly uncomfortable relationship with each other. Like this morning, for instance, I called up my mother. I call her up on every Saturday morning, and I called her up and I said, "Mummy, ma Bangalore mein aaya. Manjo 9 kitab aayo na ma unna la aayi hai." In Sindhi, basically to say that is my new book and I'm in Bangalore. So she said, "Ha, pine ho jaiya to puchaiya, bhai kithe aa kitab?" Like if your father was around, he would have asked you, "Where is this book? What is it about?" Mukhata sab kuch khabar kona pe putta. And yet the book is dedicated to her. This is also the dissonance we live with, right? That the people we write about, the people we dedicate our books to, they are not the people who would be reading these. And I think we don't pay attention to this. We don't pay attention to the fact that very often the knowledge that we have accumulated about certain lives is not available to those people about whom we've written. And the book is about those relationships, but the book is also about how do we think of experience? Why is experience seen as some kind of an anecdote and does not make its presence as the main story? Why does it appear like a case study, an addendum, something that doesn't have a generalizability? And I take these questions to various contexts in this book. So there is a chapter which looks at what is the difference, for instance, between shame and humiliation, which I observe in the context of Dalit literature and so on. There is a chapter which is simply about film songs and what are some of how a certain kind of beyond the ideological, affective relationship we have with film songs. We hum them, they stay in us, but we don't think that repository is doing anything to us. How might that actually be shaping the contours of our emotions? How that might be shaping what we think is love and romance? We don't think about those. So the book is sort of going through a various range, and yet it's a kind of a meditative book, Deepa, that could have only come to me in my 50s. It wouldn't have come earlier. And I think COVID also had something to do with it, something sort of stilled down. And I think a lot of my earlier research, I've done research on partition, on the Sindhi community, on cultural history of Gujarat, on the politics and theory of translation. But a lot of those research came out of being sort of asking incisive questions, but also sometimes seeking refuge in research, almost running away to research from a life that felt difficult, that sometimes felt hostile. Whereas this particular book is not coming out of that at all. It is actually coming out of saying that research and life are not different at all. That there might be something here. We might want to look at life itself, and we might want to look at knowledge, and we might want to see how the subjective and the objective are not actually separate at all. And when they do, it is not an easy transition, which is why I call it an uneasy translation, because it is not a translation problem that we have solved or that we have resolved, but rather we sit with the unease of that dissonance and the unease of that incommensurability. And that is what the book is about. Yeah.
Okay. Since you just spoke about your mother, Rita, the book actually has a stunning beginning. It talks about life, as Rita was just saying, and it talks about her mother. Rita asks her mother to write the story of her life. And after a couple of days of thinking about this idea, she refuses to write the book. And that's a very stunning beginning, and the way she narrates that entire episode and the things that her mother has to say about why she took the decision she took is really a fascinating. Rita, would you like to read that?
Yeah, I will read it out. I mean, just to kind of give you a background a little bit. So my mother must have gone to school in Ajmer up to about 3rd standard or something. She married at the age of 14. By the time she had me, and I'm the 5th child, she must be less than 30. I mean, that is the kind of life that she has lived. But during COVID, she kept saying, there's either too much work or there is too little, and I'm confused. I don't know what this is. And she would ask me every now and then, she would say, Rita, ye karuna kadi hali vendo? About corona, she would say karuna. And she would say, karuna kadi hali vendo? Like, when will it go away? And then I would say, no, mummy, ya hali kone vendo, but asanke rono aina sai. Sambhale rono, but we have to live with this. But she was very bewildered by it. And she didn't quite know how to situate it, how to place it, and she would say that, Vadan ka muddo, like humne badon se suna tha, we had heard from our elders, bhai Sindh mein zilzilo the, there was an earthquake in Sindh, we had heard that. We also heard about Hindustan, Pakistan, as in when partition happened. Most Sindhis don't use the word partition or batwara. They'll say Hindustan, Pakistan theo. She would say, wo sab to buddho hai, par ye karuna ichha hai, to nahi shaya. And during that period, we had a conversation, and I'm just going to read out a little bit because I'm going with this somewhere else, and I'm going actually to the question of autobiography. I'm going to the question of what it is to write an autobiography. And when we think of the autobiography as the story of the self, where is that self? And whether there is an uneasy translation between the genre and the other lives that we have. So allow me to begin just from that point. My mother was married by the time she was 14, if not earlier, and then she moved to Ahmedabad. She had studied up to the 3rd or 4th standard, but she doesn't quite remember. It gave her enough literacy to write Sindhi letters in Devanagari script to her family in Ajmer. The Sindhi schools in Rajasthan had adopted the Devanagari as opposed to the Perso-Arabic script after partition. I remember her large handwriting on postcards and inland letters that she used to send to her family. The visual memory of those letters now feels like a slice from a distant past. For at some stage, she must have stopped writing. Perhaps the phone calls substituted the letters, or she was occupied with navigating a web of conflicts in her life, and she had no leisure of that kind. From about the mid-1980s, she also joined what is called the Gita Satsang, a spiritual group, one of the many that Sindhi families follow. These satsang are perhaps a continuation of both the Peer and Guru Nanak satsang traditions that were strong in Sindh. Her large handwriting had now moved from the inland letters to diaries where she would write down Satsanga Jivani, the speeches given by the Guru or the spiritual discourses. Secular writing, for want of a better word, disappeared. Ordinarily, she would have dismissed writing letters about her life and herself as a form of Maya. However, in the period following COVID, I often found her lost and suggested that she write something from her life. A woman of 77 today, my mother, like any other non-elite woman, had had a long journey with myriad challenges, social, financial, and personal. Even as I write the word personal, I wonder if she would have used that as a separate term from the rest. Be that as it may, she entertained the possibility for the first time, and instead of making notes about Gyan, and I'm not using this term as a mockery sort of a term that the English language in India uses, she decided to try.
I was trying to write Hinanji Amuinji Atam Katha, she said to me. The word Hinan is a respectful honorific used as a third-person pronoun by Sindhi women to refer to their husbands. Literally, it means him and substitutes for the husband's name, since mentioning his name is considered inauspicious for women. Basically, my mother was saying she was writing two autobiographies, my father's and her own, or rather using the word autobiography loosely to cover the story of not one, but two people. She had spent 50 years with my father before he passed away. It is only understandable that a self outside that conjugality was unimaginable in the telling of her life story. But she realized in the course of recalling and writing that she would violate my father's memory for me, and she simply could not continue. One day, she called up to say she couldn't continue and said, "Let me tell you, nobody who says Ma Atam Katha mein sach likho hai, sach to wala hai." Nobody claiming to have been truthful while writing an autobiography is truthful. This by itself is not profound knowledge for us about the genre of the autobiography, except that she was using the word Atam Katha. Note that the Sindhis find it hard to use consonants in succession. So it's not Atma Katha as a life story, but not just her own. She laughed at the, Shabnam, please come and join. She laughed at the end of our conversation and said, "I am best left with Gyan, should just go back to write Satsang Jivani." My persuasion that I would consider her narrative of my father's life as a perspective and not an absolute truth, for he may have had his own, was incomprehensible to her. No, she said, truth hurts, the matter ended there. And then I basically go on to say that, we think about, for instance, many kinds of lives of women who write, but what do we do about non-writing? What do we do about the fact that the autobiography for her is not the story of one person? It is not the story of oneself, but it is impossible for her to think of it as a nuclear family. The autobiography for her is the undivided family. And the self is not able to prize itself outside that conjugality. How do we reconcile these lived lives and the genre of the autobiography? And some of the chapter is a meditation around that, but I think I'll stop here.
Hi, Shabnam.
But just I wanted to start by congratulating you, Rita, because I think this book engaged both my Vivek and Bhav, which I think is so important for scholarly enterprises. And as I was reading your book, repeatedly, you will forgive me, a Kabir Doha would keep coming up for me, which was, "Haan kahun to hai nahi, ना कहूं तो है, हाँ और ना के बीच में जो कुछ है सो है." So if I say it is, it isn't. If I say it isn't, it is. Between yes and no, between presence and absence, whatever it is. And I thought your book really was expressing in many, many subtle, astonishingly layered ways the ineffability of experience. And I think that's what this Doha is also trying to say, which is that language fails us, perhaps linguistically, but as you demonstrate so powerfully, because it is embedded in hegemonic structures of power, and therefore it fails us in experience, in sharing experience. But then you proceed to argue that experience is knowledge itself, and you systematically demolish what goes for institutionalized knowledge, textual knowledge, and you bring it into the realm of experience. And I was just so gratified and thrilled to read. It was like, yes, how you bring the unabashedly subjective into the understanding of what constitutes knowledge, how you bring the anecdotal, the personal, that which is not seamlessly articulated, but in fact that which is broken, which is elliptical, which has gaps and silences, and how you privilege all of that as the site of knowledge, not as the site of experience, which is then illustrating some theory, but knowledge itself. I found this statement astonishing, that experience is its own knowledge. It is not that experience substantiates thought or theory. It is one with knowledge to begin with. And this was very thrilling for me to hear, this idea of finding knowledge elsewhere, as you put it. So my question to you is pedagogical to some degree, because you very movingly show how many of these insights come to you in the space of the classroom, right? Which is another refreshing area of, I've never heard anybody reflect on that. So maybe I'm not that well read. But I found that very moving. If you don't teach theory in the classroom, what do? How do you teach experience in a classroom? And if you could even maybe talk of examples of texts that you taught, translated in the classroom to bring attention to this idea of experience as the site of knowledge, would be very useful.
Before I actually illustrate, Shabnam, something from the book, I just want one small example I want to give you. I was teaching Atya Hussein's Sunlight on a Broken Column in class. And there's a lot of description about this huge mansion in which, the protagonist used to live. Then she moves to England, but she remembers the house. There's a lot of tactile way by which she remembers the house. You could actually feel, like you can get the texture of the walls, and you can get a sense of where the zanana would be and where the baithak would be and all of that. And while I was doing it, and I could see that the memory of that home is such an important part of this kind of writing. And very often in literary discussions, and Vanamala would know this, there are people here who've taught literature, we talk about the homelessness. And we talk about the homelessness usually as a diasporic longing, right? It sort of emerges very often in that context. And when I was reading this, and I was thinking of the number of homes that I changed with my family, because my father his business went from bad to worse. And every time we moved to a more and more modest home. So no move was a happy one. And in some sense, while we were losing homes, as a feeling, just as a feeling, it wasn't homelessness. It was a homefulness. It was being filled too much, with memories of home. And I thought that, and I almost wanted to say it to the students, but I didn't say it. And I left the class thinking, what would have happened if I had said it? What would have happened if I had pushed back and say, you know what, dude, this is not homelessness. This is homefulness, because I know what I'm talking about. But I think when we enter as teachers in the class, we want our roles to be mystified as intellectuals, not as real people who have gone through real experiences. And we take refuge in a Heidegger, in a Derrida. We quote this person. We teach our students to quote these higher authorities. And I think we don't teach them, because we don't do this ourselves, to say what are some of the shaping forces, these particularisms, that are smelly, that are odorous. But you know what? Maybe something lies there. Maybe it will help me push back a certain kind of disembodied metropolitan theory of white dead men that you impose upon us all the time, and you make us feel small, almost like we can't cope with it, whereas our reality is quite different. So if a tribal student comes to my class, I think I need to learn from that student. How does he reconcile a new Christian faith he has embraced, along with certain other gods he may have been worshipping, how all the readings that I'm giving on syncretic literature and on tribal life is actually condescending. That there might be something in that life that those readings need to know. But you know what? They would have an urban researcher like us going into that field, talking about them, but we don't want to see that how their experience might push back something. So I think in the process, I sort of left that class and I thought, what would have happened if I had said it? Would it have scandalized them? Would it have made uncomfortable? Would it be narcissistic to talk about this? And I began to make notes. I began to make notes about these issues, and somewhere along the line, I began to actually, some of the book actually started taking shape. But having said that, I also want to talk to you about, Shabnam mentioned pedagogy. There is a chapter or an essay in this book. The book reads like a book, but it's also a bunch of essays. I mean, whichever way you want to look at it. But there is one particular essay which I call Scripting Caste, Pedagogies of Translation. And it kind of begins by saying that, I used to teach Dalit literature at Ashoka. I taught it for about 2 years. And we would look at Dalit autobiographies, stories, and what have you. This is an elite school, right? The classroom is almost entirely upper caste and upper class. And they would read, their hearts would break, they would be moved by it. But they ended up anthropologizing this person. You understand? And there was no reflection on the fact that caste is not consigned only to this, that we are also people produced by caste. It is not to say that we are casteless people. There is a certain way by which, the upper caste tends to think of themselves as the secular modern, almost as if these definitions don't apply to us. And so I felt that my course is only reinforcing it. So in the second year of my course, at the end of the course, I said to the students, you know what? I think I've made a mistake. I think I want you to do an assignment where I teach another course next time, but do not include a single Dalit text. Include anti-caste intellectuals whose thought we will look at, but the literary text will be, but thoroughly average, normal people. And we will decode caste there. Like, what does Arundhati Roy have to say about Velutha and God of Small Things, right? What does Gita Hariharan have to say about her latest novel or whatever? So I felt like these are not questions we ask. We almost think caste is only in Dalit literature. And so I changed the course. I began to call it Scripting Caste, as in what is the script of caste and how it might be elliptic, right? And how it might sometimes be covert and whatever. So if you have, for instance, in Ghachar Gochar, there is an instance of the Amma, realizing that there is a garlic smell coming from somewhere. You know something is being said here about who the family might be, and so on. So I began to actually look for instances like that. And meanwhile, then I thought, okay, let's go to another course called Indian Literature. And I don't want to make this agrahara now of this is where caste belongs, this is where I will disrupt this whole thing. And so in that course, I imagine myself experimenting by doing a Dalit story, but not in a way that it leads you to externalizing that Dalit, but it leads you for you to understand that we might have a role to play in this. And I think that is a story. It's called Creamy Layer. Do I have the time to talk? Yeah. Its story is called Creamy Layer. It appears in, Alif book, The Greatest Gujarati Stories Ever Told. And it's written by Neerav Patel, a writer that I have, I've been very, very close friends with. He passed away. And it's a very interesting story about a couple called Mr. and Mrs. Waghela. And the story begins by saying Mr. and Mrs. Waghela lived in Mumbai. And I begin there. And I say that, okay, if we were to do this story, let's say in this kind of a gathering, the words Mr. and Mrs. Waghela lived in Mumbai, how does it read in English? It just means there's a surname, right? Perhaps an Indian surname, an ethnic surname. How would a Gujarati person read it? A Gujarati person would know that Waghela is a Rajput surname. There was a Waghela dynasty. But a Gujarati person might also realize that sometimes Dalits take on Rajput surnames. And that doubleness would work at the back of your mind. You can clearly see how when you think through bhashas, your reading becomes very, very different, right? Now imagine if I were to, and then I go on to say that, so Mr. and Mrs. Waghela lived in Mumbai, and then it goes on to say that their daughter is getting married, and Mr. Waghela is kind of flustered. There are wedding cards to be made, and then there are catering arrangements, and he's using a lot of word in English, right? Saying catering, party plot. Gujus do a lot of party plot, right? So catering, party plot, and so on. All that is fine. You just have to keep tearing leaves of a checkbook and so on. But the problem is, what do we do with the kankotri, as in the wedding card? And then he thinks, okay, the kankotri, there is one kankotri for the daughter's friends. The daughter works with an airline company. She's getting married to someone called Joshi or Srivastav. Once again, the English language will not tell you that these are Brahmin surnames, right? And she's getting married to that. And then, so one kankotri for wedding card for them. How's that kankotri? Again, you and I will recognize, given who we are, where we belong, our location, that kankotri, our wedding card, is understated. It has matte finish. The Ganesh is in this abstract form. It's kind of as economic as possible, right? It's not wearing it on its sleeve. You know how sometimes you see certain garish things and we immediately jump to a conclusion and we say, oh my God, it's like so. So they do this understated kind of, and one nice Sanskrit shloka there, and so on. So I begin to pick on these little things because my attempt then is to say, how do we understand that this story is not about them only? This story is as much about us. And then I push it, and then they want to do a kankotri for their community in the village. What is called Natila in Gujarati, etle Natna Loko. They want to do another kankotri for the people in the village. So then what do? Do it in Gujarati. That is what they think should be done. So they do it in Gujarati. And then the husband and wife both go to this village where they haven't been in years. So it is a story about Dalit modernity. It is about the rupture, right, of people who have moved away from that place and so on. They go back to that village, carrying their Bisleri bottle, water, and, and the entire Nath or the extended family appears to them and they look a bit dirty to them. And the people are looking at them almost like these guys are Pardesi and so on. And then they said, Baudare aaya tame bhai, you came after. And then there is immediately a dialectical switch. The language changes. And they say, Baudare tame bhai aaya, humne to tame bhul hi gaya. And they go on in this manner. Then they look at the card and so on. And then they look at someone looks at the card and then looks at them and he's like, Ba, ahu karyu tame? There is a person here who looks like you, suited and booted, Pardesi type person. You forgot our gods and goddesses. Who's this person? Ambedkar. He says, ahu karyu bhai? Ahu. બધા કપડા પહેર્યા છે ને બધા પરદેશી જેવા દેખાય છે ને આપણા ચાવડા મન ભૂલી ગયા તમે. And this man is flabbergasted that such a big chasm exists between, and wherever they go, people out of love, affection, whatever respect are giving them this kadak mithi cha, like with a thick layer of malai on it. And by this time, Mr. and Mrs. Waghela live in Bombay, right? Their lives have changed. And they find it a little icky. They don't like and they keep saying, no, we've had tea. And the entire day goes in this manner and many things happen. I don't want to bore you with all the details. But when they reach back home, tired, realizing how alienated they are from the community, but also realizing how some changes have happened, but they haven't happened in ways that we thought would happen. Their daughter, oblivious of this caste question, she says, Mummy and Papa in the back and Mama, Mami, bada avshane, they'll all come right for the wedding. And they're like, yeah, whatever, And they said, ja beta cha banai le. But, joje, creamy layer na nakti ema. Because they themselves have become creamy layer, right? We know what the word creamy layer means in the caste context. So I go on to then show that how there is a self-loathing in this story, right? That I don't like this creamy layer anymore because there is a rupture, right? I can't belong to that community. I don't want to, but I'm also not comfortable not belonging. And how do we locate this split, this strange state of being? And who is responsible for this? We might think it is happening only in Mr. Vaghela's mind, but we've contributed to it, right? Some of this is also coming from the upper caste mode of being, our aesthetic of being, our way of being, and an assimilation into our life that creates very often in an upwardly mobile marginal people a sense that he or she needs to become like us. We are contributing somewhere. And I think that is how hegemony works. So then the entire chapter demonstrates what might be the various ways of language, registers, dialects of looking at this and pushing it, but most of the time pushing it also through anti-caste intellectuals and using D.R. Nagaraj, Ambedkar, and so on and so forth, and then coming at the end to this, that we might have contributed to this creamy layer and how it feels about it. So that at the end of it, we don't go away consigning this as a Dalit story. We go away consigning this as a caste story that is as much theirs as it is ours, right? And I think this is what I've been trying to do in many situations. How might we situate our concerns in our own bhashas and modes of thinking that might take us somewhere, rather than moving us away even further, Yeah.
Rita, this whole book talks about how experience that doesn't translate into knowledge. So if we could understand the textual as that which is said and the non-textual as that which is felt, Choka Mela's poem is a stunning example. And Baswana wrote something very similar to Choka Mela's poem. Both these poems, as Sundar Sarukai says in the afterword, seems to question if theory is the afterlife of experience. Can't experience remain as the afterlife of experience? Or, as you point out, take note of the signs underneath the text, which can well belong to the realm of intuition or understanding. That's one part of the question I want to ask. The other part is, moving on, you rightly discuss samskara as also speaking of the limits of textual knowledge as against that which is available by being with the world. It's also, as you say, shifting the terms of self as language changes. Aren't we, in a way, even when we read change and difference, trying to codify them? Aren't we making an assumption that a thing remains the same even when the quality or state changes? For instance, the song becoming a musical text. When we speak of change, aren't we also presupposing an unchanging essence of something?
Yeah, I think there are lots of questions there, Deepa, but maybe I'll focus on the textual knowledge because that is more central to... So every now and then the book is like quoting a kho from Gujarati, or it is quoting Chokha Mera, or it's quoting Kabir. And this idea that when you say that, ye jo kitabi gyan hai, this textual knowledge, what is it going to do for me? And in some sense, Anantamurti's Samskara, which I discuss at great length in one of the early essays, I show that basically Praneshacharya, when he needs to dispose Naranappa's body, and there is a dilemma in the Agrahara as to what is to be done with this body and so on, and he seeks from Lord Maruti some kind of answer that someone who has not lived as a Brahmin, is the dead body a body of a Brahmin, right? When does Brahminhood end, so to speak? And what is the relationship between someone who did not practice Brahminhood, but who in theory is a Brahmin? And when he does not find an answer to that question, I actually locate that moment as a breakdown of textual knowledge. and a breakdown of Gyan Marg. And this question comes up every now and then in the book, that there is a breakdown of Gyan Marg. Sometimes a Bhakti Marg may have answers, but sometimes just a life of experience may have answers, and so on. So, yeah, and sometimes, so this thread kind of continues in various kinds of situations. So for instance, there is an essay about saying it, not saying it. You know, it is about silences and decoding silences, which is an essay about Hindi film songs. Because Hindi film songs shape us, they play a big role for some of us. I'm not saying for all of us, but maybe something else does for all of us. And I think they make, as I said earlier, the contours of the romantic and the love and so on. But this, very often, the language of the songs is its own linguistic universe. It has very little to do with what those words actually mean anatomically, right? So then I go into, what does dil mean, for instance? मैं नहीं कह रहा हूं, दिल कह रहा है. मेरे दिल ने आज कहा तेरी जुल्फ हटा दूं, मेरे दिल ने कहा ये कर दूं, मैं नहीं कह रहा हूं. And I'm transferring it to the dil because I can't say it myself, right? Or very often I'm looking at your eyes and, शरबती तेरी आंखों में झील सी गहराई में मैं डूब जाता हूं. And you think, well, is it eyes or some other organ of the body? Like, what is going on here? And I feel like there is a certain kind of a coded universe here, which is its own world, and what it is to understand that world and to translate it, and so on. So, I think, I just want to say to Shabnam and Deepa both that the book actually plays. Sometimes it shows that something translates, sometimes it shows that it breaks down. So your question about change and immutability, I think I want to say that we are not coming away with one final view on this subject. We are not. Because really speaking, I'm not saying sometimes language precedes experience, sometimes language enhances the experience, and sometimes meaning is not contingent upon language. Right? So there are many situations that happen here, and I think like one of the questions the book asks is, what is it to represent suffering? Right? Do we have an adequate language to represent suffering? Then it asks, for instance, what is the finitude of institutionalized knowledge? Right? Only what gets recognized as knowledge in universities and academia is that the only knowledge. And I use a story from Vijay Dandeta, a story about an old woman, a dokri. So there are many questions that ask, but in all of that, there is still a tentativeness, Deepa. I don't have a view that finally, I think I do want to push institutionalized knowledge with these questions. But I am not saying whether everything is translatable or it is not translatable. I am saying something or the other slips through the cracks. And what might that be?
Yeah, in fact, I would say further that sometimes you also talk about how we are not ourselves aware of the experience and what it means, and to privilege non-closure of meaning itself, But I'd like to ask you to maybe talk a little bit about chapter 6, which I found very interesting, which is called Uneasy Translations, and how you show that it's very difficult sometimes to translate between languages because there are whole world views, in a sense, embedded in language frameworks. And I found it very interesting, this particular example that you give of Bhavan Bhagat.
Okay.
And how the character of Bhavan Bhagat is a Dalit who invokes both a socio-political understanding and a spiritual understanding. And you say he fades away in English. In the English translation, you say the language itself doesn't allow you to grasp that non-dual holding of the spiritual and the social in one space. I was very intrigued by that. Because I think in my own experience, I have seen that coated, suited Baba Ambedkar picture on the wall along with Kabir, while Dalit youth will dance. And for them, very often, there is no dichotomy there. You know, and it's interesting, this poem also that Bhavan Bhagat recites. It's so beautiful. It's, look, there sits the swan on the edge of the brimming lake. Over him stretches the pearl-filled sky. You know, and the lake is a coded image for the sensual, for the bhautik, for the of this world. And the sky is the transcendent. And he is able to hold both. So what is it about English that made a character like Bhavan Bhagat?
Well, it is its modernity, its agency, right? There's a huge allure of agency in the English language. So before I come to Bhavan Bhagat, maybe this will provide a prelude to that discussion. This particular essay, the last essay in the book, it's called Uneasy Translations. It begins actually by, saying that we are coming to a conclusion, but actually there is no conclusion here, and so on. And then it goes on to talk about failure. I mean, translators sitting here know that we live with failure. But what are the rich lessons of failure? I think there are huge philosophical lessons of failure, and I think we need to talk about them more. Very often we say to somebody, but I tried, but it didn't quite work. It just didn't sound okay, but we know there is something else there, something that is tugging at us, but we are not able to put it in words. And what might that be? To what extent is it linguistically coded? To what extent is it the intangible experience of some kind which we are not able to do? So for instance, there was in one of the early translations, a book I did, Modern Gujarati Poetry, there was a poem called Na Thaya, which means nahi hua, ya nahi bana. And it is a ghazal, right? And like a ghazal, you know what a ghazal does with the radif and the kafiya? One line sets out a proposition, the other line sometimes demolishes it or takes it to some ironic place and says it is not possible. So for instance, this na thaya as in nahi hua, it begins by saying aam achhata na thaya, aam ughada na thaya, haath phoolon mein jabodya toy sungwada na thaya. Ki humne apne haath खुशबू में भिगो दिए, लेकिन जब हम सूंघने लगे तो उसमें खुशबू थी नहीं. It didn't have fragrance, right? And then it goes on to give you situations like that, saying festivities which occurred in our house did not become ours. Gher avel prasangoy amara na thaya. Now, why would that happen? That something that is so proximate, and yet fulfillment didn't happen. You thought it is right there, but then it is a mirage, right? And the entire ghazal, so that every line would go something, and the second line would say, na thaya, nahi hua. But the entire ghazal has no subject position. Right? It doesn't say I, or this, or that, and so on. And the last couplet says, Aaj varsad nathi em na ko Ramesh. I mean, this is a silly line in Bangalore today. Aaj varsad nathi em na ko Ramesh, em ko hashe, apne bina na thaya. Like, don't, ye mat kaho ki aaj barish nahi hui. Kaho hui hogi, hum gile nahi hue. Agar aap gile nahi hue, to ye kiska dosh hai? Barish ka dosh hai, ki aapka dosh hai? Who is to be blamed for it? Maybe I stood in the rain and I'm still not drenched. Why have I come out so dry? What is it that didn't suffice, that didn't imbue me? I don't know. When we translated this into English, and I consider this as one of my worst translations, but it haunted me all my life. Because I kept thinking, what was it? And we went on to say it did not happen. And apart from the fact that the rhythm didn't work, but that is still, the rhythm was very much part of the philosophy. There is a certain way by which English needed to lay it out as a proposition. The syntax is very often also about the way the worldview is arranged. And the idea that I name it as it did not happen, that did not happen, I did not become wet is so agential. The modernity of the English language makes you pin down the blame somewhere. Like in the Bible, you could say, my Lord, I have sinned. When you translate that into Hindi or Gujarati, you say, Prabhu, मुझसे पाप हो गया. You don't say, Prabhu, मैंने पाप किया. You don't say कि मैंने पेन गिरा दी. You say, I dropped my pen, but you say, pen गिर गई. This passive construction that you use very often is because we do not become the karta. We do not take the agency or the responsibility or the arrogance of being the site of that origin. And it has a mixed result. It also means that sometimes we don't take the responsibility of actions that we should. Like in Gujarat, when the carnage happened, people would say, "Ha, तूफानो थया." अरे भाई तूफानो थया मतलब क्या? You know, first of all, you use a euphemistic language. तूफान थयू. It's not तूफान यार, मारा तुम लोगों ने. कोई छोटी सी बात नहीं थी. But you will also say, आपरामा एवं हुआ, इम्मा एवं. You know, you use language in a way that it is not saying who एवं कहूँ. Like I am saying this, and therefore that section kind of discusses what is this business about agency, about responsibility, about absolution that language provides to you and so on. And then I go on to talk about this Dalit novel Angariyat, which I translated many years ago. And it continued to have great lessons. So its failure, so to speak, is not quite like this poem. But this character, Bhavan Bhagat, has haunted me all my life. I mean, Bhavan Bhagat, as Shabnam said, is a fascinating man. He is like the community's spokesperson, but also in his own trip kind of a man who understands कि माया में क्या करना होता है, who understands व्यवहार में क्या करना होता है, and yet he can't be bothered about either. Some days he just takes his like ektara and goes away, and he's politically savvy, but he's also very detached, and he moves into these different worlds as this larger than life, this lovely man. And I always felt my English Bhavan Bhagat is not that. Like I just don't have it. And I always felt, what is it that I've not? And I realized that English has a duality of the political, which cannot be spiritual. The political needs to be, if he's a Dalit person and he says that you guys need to wake up, enough now. But he's not speaking in Ambedkarite politics. It's coming to him from elsewhere. Ambedkar is hardly known in this novel. Somebody makes a passing reference saying, "Eh bhai, pehla Handyakar se na kaun? To kaun Handyakar?" They don't get the name Ambedkar right. Right? And then someone says, Handyakar, Gandhi zyada bantu nahi, nahi? Like he doesn't get along well with Gandhi at all. So they talk like that. But their sense of the spiritual and the political, they come from a place which does not see that duality. And I felt like my English does not have enough to hold a person like that. And I think there are many people like that, which we are not able to hold. Or English will make a fetish out of it. Right? He's this, but he's also that. You know, he's religious, but he's also secular. I mean, what? You know what I mean? So I think that is the uneasy translation. So I use several instances. Not all examples are translations that I have done, or there is an instance of Premchand's story, a very, very well-known story that you may have heard of. It's Thakur Ka Kuan, right? And it's about this Gangi who needs to get clean water for her husband who's dying, and there's no clean water. The only well that exists belongs to the Thakur. And then by the time she brings the water after escaping the luscious gaze of the Thakur and what have you, the husband has drunk that awful water and so on. This is how Premchand had a sympathetic view of the poor and the marginalized and what have you. Almost 40, 50 years later, Om Prakash Valmiki, a Dalit writer, which Premchand was not, writes a poem called Thakur Ka Kuan. And the poem almost goes on in the step-by-step manner, saying that, you know, Zameen Thakur ki, Gehu Thakur ka, wo Thakur ka, Hal, and then Hal Thakur ka, Hal pe muthi hamari. This belongs to the Thakur, that belongs to but the labor is ours. And then goes on to say, but the harvest belongs to the Thakur. And this, so then he goes on to say, to hamara kya? Shahar, gaon, desh? And the poem ends there. And I was thinking, what is Om Prakash Valmiki trying to do? And I felt he was in conversation with Premchand by saying, you were all very good. You had this sympathy with these characters, but because you are not a Dalit, you don't understand. There is a systemic problem here. It goes all the way down, and you don't get it. That it is not only about the well or the water not being available to you. It has to do with the fact that those who labor and those who profit out of the labor, they are always different people. And the country belongs to the other ones, or us ones. And I think this is what, so when I looked at this poem, and I thought, let me try and see what happens. And I tried it in English, and the fact that ye uska, ye uska, ye uski, uska Thakur ka. And I realized that in English, I needed to constantly say belongs to or is, in the sense that I had to keep splitting the words into sometimes one of belonging and one of possessing, in a way that Hindi did not need it. And I thought there is something here that grammatically does not work. But grammar is not different from semantics. It's not different from other worldviews. So I thought, like translation, when we talk about the problems of translation and the agony over it, people always talk about how do you say bindi in English? How do you say gulab jamun in English? Do you say sweet meat or not? Do I say vermilion? I mean, those are not even problems. Just say what you have to say. But very often it boils down to such little things. But there is so much those little things go on to do. They can be boring little details that some anal people like us are interested in. But believe me, they have some very, very big things to say. And I think I wanted to complicate that for myself, and also not only for translators, but also the world at large that thinks translation is about whatever, from this to that and so forth.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rita. I think you really laid out the spirit and the scope of the book. And I think we'll open it up now for questions from the audience. Yes.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. The self is we all have inner narratives, and the self is the story of the inner narrative. In all of this, the collective unconscious, which is the archetypical memory of the corpus of all our experiences, shines across irrespective of tradition, culture, ethnicity. You may read a Homer's Iliad, or you may read the Gospel according to Christ or Buddha. They go beyond the transliteration and touch the very psyche of humans. Homo sapiens, I think that's where we are today. How does that view hold on to, the idea that self is a textual reference to a this or that, or an either and or?
Actually, I'm not very sure that there is this stable view of the self that emerges out of the many examples that you give. In fact, your examples are so much about, people being on this odyssey, seeking something outside. And very often, in fact, questions of the self get quite marginalized in your own examples. So I'm not sure that, but coming back maybe to the more central question that you were asking, whether there is an inner narrative and the self which occupies the place in that inner narrative. So the teller and the tale and the one that is being told about, they are not entirely separate and distinct entities either, right? So for instance, one of the poems that I quote in an essay here is Ramanujan's poem, and I think I'll just respond with that and end it. And Ramanujan's poem Self-Portrait talks about saying that against the famous law of optics or whatever, he says, I'm looking at in the shop windows, I'm looking at what I think is my own image, but I see someone there and I see the signature of my father. Right? And this idea, therefore, that in that mirroring, do we manage to see ourselves? Is there a self that is outside the collectivity? Is that even available to us, which does not carry the stamp of something or the other? And I think my meditation about the self is never of self as this completely atomic, autonomous, untouched, unpolluted, uncorrupted self. It is never there. When you read the book, you will see that, in fact, it is precisely that I question. Yeah.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much. I don't think I was ready for what I walked into today. I feel very deeply impacted by what you said. So, I found it personally very relatable because I feel like the hegemony I was trying to run away was patriarchy in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, which resulted in running away from Telugu.
Yeah.
So as an adult today, and you're talking about conversing with your mother, so for me, everything modern was English.
Yeah.
So over the course of 10 years, I've stopped speaking in Telugu. I don't think in it.
Yeah.
But today, I'm reading Volga's works, which I didn't realize back then that feminist writing existed in Telugu because our state textbooks don't include anything progressive or radical until school. So I was actually at Ashoka where I was introduced to certain things that I didn't know existed about my own culture.
Right.
Now, in speaking to my mother, I have no language in Telugu to talk about psychic liberation or in terms of what is it for a woman to think about herself. So I was very curious what you could say about repair of this kind
So beautiful. Thank you so much. That's such a lovely response. And it is so close to, to actually some of the conversations in this book. There is an essay called Elsewhere, Gender and Translation, which will be particularly relevant to you, to the question. And there's also one called Language and Incomplete Travels. And basically I say that how when we want to reinvent ourselves, we sometimes change the language, right? And sometimes even a syllabic change goes a long way. If I don't want to be identified in Gujarat as a Dehati person, I will not say who, I will say shu. I will not say hu kehta do. Tu kehta do. I'll say shu kehta tha. Make it like. So, and sometimes you give up, you do it in English. And in that essay, I talk a lot about how, for instance, my mother's words in Sindhi about how a girl should behave. And I heard it bloody all my life. And I'm the fourth daughter. She was giving this gyan to every daughter, and every sibling of mine has done this classics in the arranged marriage and so on. And she would say, "Chokri, vaat to kholi, to sadu ghar khatam thi vane." A girl can't something like that, or but this assisa vaat na khol bya, nagala. And when my mother-in-law didn't allow me to, she said, you can't take up a job right now, you're doing an MPhil, who will look after the house? She actually said all that. And I thought, this is too much, but you're not that kind of a family. I thought, hello? And I didn't know what to say. But I said, but mommy, I thought you were quite modern and you didn't. And then even when I'm saying it, I'm hearing my mother's words in Sindhi in my head saying, Chokri vaat na khol. And I'm thinking should I listen to that voice, or should my English is telling me this is unfair? Should I own up to my English, or should I listen to that Sindhi voice? And I'm just go away. Right now I need to talk about this, but you also feel guilty. So there is a certain way by which these languages, they exist in you, but to come to your point about what is repair, I think it's important to write it down, to recognize it and own up to that Telugu. I don't think languages, it is true that we've heard more patriarchal languages, more patriarchal things in our own languages. But there's nothing to stop you from having a conversation with that language. Everybody deserves a conversation. Surely your language does. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Well, from one Rita to another Rita.
Yeah.
I really was so unprepared when I walked in, met you for what, English honors has been my subject, but this is like I am back again in college, but of another level. Was I in a philosophy class? I was asking myself, and you have analyzed, unless you're so deeply spiritual, you cannot analyze even English, or you cannot write these essays. What you have written, it comes from a very deep sense of self. So it looks English on the surface, but there's something else happening below it. So, my goodness, today I'm going back enlightened. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Congratulations, Rita.
Thanks, Vanamala.
Rita and I have been on this journey for long years together in different spaces, but teaching Indian literatures in the English classroom. And that has been a very rewarding experience because through translations into English, it opened up a very different world, which was not Kannada or Malayalam or Bengali, nor was it English. It was an in-between space, which allowed us the space to interrogate. And the strangeness of it, the novelty of it, the incommensurability of, English and Malayalam maybe, and the gaps. This, like which most people will say, oh, translation, they can never match up. And so, this kind of a very purist kind of attitude to the original and so on. But for us as teachers in the classroom, if you want to open up an issue, and talk about it, make students look at it, translations really offer you that world of experience with which they can really see what is happening. And that has been a very, very rich, outcome of translations. And, like Shabnam mentioned, how we haven't read too much about classroom as a space of creating new knowledge. Right, it is true, and Rita's attempt has been that how to use the space of a classroom to, generate different perspectives, ask different questions, and that has been a very enriching experience. So, though I agree with you that your Bhagat, that character, may not have been as lively as that person was in the Gujarati, but, a little pale in English, I still feel that effort is worthwhile. I still feel that it's absolutely an enabling space to use, because otherwise we miss out this whole world.
No, sir, that is never under dispute. Yeah.
Therefore, I think rather than sort of, going along with people who kind of see or treat translation as a derivative discourse, as a secondary thing, I would like to kind of put it on, give it a little more of privileging, that it has enabled so many questions to be asked. And especially in a pedagogic place and also in a larger cultural space where we need to be asking questions today. I think translations do offer that space.
No, the question was not whether to translate or not.
Congratulations on this whole effort. Thank you.
Good evening. Quick question on, is this a Sisyphean task that you're trying to capture all the nuances? I mean, I would argue that any creative work, you probably never, the creator is never going to be able to capture everything that he or she intended. So why should we be so flustered about this in the context of language?
So, Sisyphean task, you mean of translating? True. No, it shouldn't be. But I think, what does that incompleteness have to tell you about life? Should we not mind those lessons? Should we not pay attention to what is that incompleteness about? And it is not to say that we think completion will happen, but there might be rich philosophical lessons in it, which are beyond the cliches of translation, about whether you can translate or you cannot, whether you can write or you cannot. Because I think those forms of incompleteness also tell us something about who we are, right? I mean, looking at that Om Prakash Valmiki's poem and trying to translate it, it gave me a new insight into Premchand's story. Right? And so in that sense, the book ends by saying that this is a verb, not a noun. Right? And I think there is even in saying, oh, everything is like that, and it is Sisyphean, is to basically say, let's not stop and meditate upon it. Let's seal it and move on. And I think we do this all the time about too many things. We seal it and we move on. What is wrong in sitting with it? I want to sit with it. I want to feel uncomfortable. I'm not self-flagellating. I think I'm a pretty good translator, but that does not mean I can't have failures. I want to sit with the knowledge of being both. I don't want to resolve it quickly. Right? So it is a meditation on the idea of sitting with something.
Thank you, Rita. Wonderful. I have read a fair amount of the book, had great conversations with you, and yet it is always continually enlightening. So thank you for that. I wanted to ask you about something in relation to the story you said about in class saying homefulness, not homelessness. And I want to push back. And what would happen if I brought that to the class? And I was thinking about this in relation to something I read a while ago in teaching, saying a bunch of women academics all adopt this stoic persona.
Yeah.
For the danger of being seen as women academics, or for the danger of having emotions dumped at your doorstep that you don't know what to do with. So stoicism becomes armor. And then I was thinking about what David Foster Wallace is called the great male narcissists, where all their characters are them. And he's quoting John Updike at that point of time, where they feel free to insert themselves in the text all the damn time. But women have to be stoic, or you can't bring yourselves. And all this meandering to say, when you wrote this, right, what did you think about the risk of the fact that you are so central to this book? Or when your mother says, my life is not just my life, it's everybody's life, which a lot of people writing their own lives never thought of. They didn't think that they thought they had license to write about everybody that happened to come into their lives. So I want to know what it means to write this in terms of gender, as a mode of writing, as a mode of attentiveness.
You know, a very eminent political scientist, and they're usually men, read one of the chapters and said, the chapter existed in a slightly different fashion at that time. I mean, in the sense it was much more meandering and long, and there's an essay here on shame. It's called The Illegibility of Shame. Earlier it was actually meant to be an essay on humiliation. And then I realized that no, sometimes you don't feel humiliated because you feel too much shame. That shame actually inhibits humiliation. And so I don't want to talk too much about it. Maybe you can read but it existed in a particular form at that time. And this friend, academic, whatever, said, yeah, Rita, it's like a stream of consciousness. And I felt very offended. Like, I thought, okay, why is there too much of the self in it? Is there no structure in it? Is it too long in it? So there is something gendered even about those things. Like the subjective needs to be kept out, the structure has to be in a particular way and all of that. Finally, I abandoned a lot of it because I didn't need it, because my argument had changed and it had evolved and so on. So yes, I think that did, a couple of times I did stop in my tracks. And I think there is a very fine balance, right, Matangi, between a certain kind of navel gazing and owning up to the self. When do you know that you are not doing the other? So I said to one of my women readers, a very close friend, ऐसा तुमको लगे बहुत मैं कर रही हूँ तो मुझे बता देना, because I don't want to do that. And yet I can't write about experience and self without actually inserting in this something of my story, because my story is not separate from what I teach. I teach what I teach because of who I am, right? So it did worry me. And maybe I could go back to Deepa's question when she said, how did you come to write this? Perhaps I wouldn't have written this, Matangi, in my younger days. I'm 53 and really I don't care.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you all for the wonderful conversation. My question might be a little bit related to another question that was asked, but it deals with caste particularly and your work with caste. Because it's so deeply rooted in our culture, in our way of being, there is a certain kind of inevitability to it, right? And it can be a little bit glib, the inevitability of, say, teaching a Dalit literatures course to an almost all upper caste class, or giving a talk in a fairly upper caste location like BIC. What keeps you going, and how do you not give up?
So let me see if I've understood you. No, she'll need the mic. Let me see if I've understood you correctly. Are you saying that it is glib to do Dalit literature in a...
No, as in...
Because I'm not doing it. So I'm not sure you got that argument right.
No, as in the hold of caste in our society. The almost inescapability of it. To undo that, or it almost seems impossible. And that can be depressing, right? Do you get depressed? Yeah.
You mean the fact that annihilation of caste is an unconcluded project? And I think if we were not to think of ourselves as casteless people, there is still a possibility. It needs to be first acknowledged to be able to annihilate. And it's not a physical thing that we would be able to annihilate. All we can do is to try and be more responsible people and to be better people and to recognize that we are all work in progress. Right? I am very suspicious of woke language. I find, since you are familiar with Ashoka, you would know how much woke language there is in these institutions. Every second sentence, if you say, oh my God, that's so Savarna, I don't think that. I think we need to keep quiet and we need to engage quietly and to say, okay, I hadn't noticed this. Let me be careful about this. Right? Let me not jump in. Let me understand as to where this is going. And I think that slow work, what I call the small work of language, I do it through language. I do it through small things. And I find that is the best I can do. This is my nature of engagement. I can't do anything more. But this I can do, is to kind of try and pay attention. Earlier, for instance, when I was about to say that I used the word allowed, I mean, look at the way it just slipped away. Such a problematic word, right? When women say allowed. I said my mother-in-law didn't allow. Well, like, what kind of word is that? You know what I mean? So I think there is a certain kind of self-reflexivity and a certain alertness that we do need to have. I am not doing anything more than this. Yeah?
One more contextual question because you're talking about translations. You use the word splice in the beginning of your talk. Unfortunately, that's one of the words in English which actually means itself and its opposite. Was that a conscious choice of words?
I can't even remember I used I think it occurs in that first extract that Deepa asked me to, yeah. And, no, I can't. No. I think the line is somewhat different in that particular section. If there was time, I would have read it out to you. Yeah. Here's Gitanjali.
Yes. Hi. So, actually, हज़ारें questions and घणाई questions in ताला पर हिक ॻाल्हि मां ज़रूर चवंदमि भई तव्हांखे हिते वेठल ॾिसी ऐं तव्हां सिंधीअ में हेॾो आराम सां ॻाल्हायो था त जाम ख़ुशी थी थिए ऐं I'm just saying that it's really a privilege to have somebody on a hot seat and talking in Sindhi. It's for somebody like me, it's we've had a very long journey for us to be here.
Yeah.
That's one thing. Also coming to your mother and then of course my mother, that they don't understand what we are doing in this world. But we are doing something. For my mother, it's Chaki kamti kare. I'm doing some काम कुछ काम कर रही हूँ मैं. But I feel like our mothers have this huge treasure trove inside them, and because they haven't had that exposure, so then they don't know how to express it.
The idea, Gitanjali, was not to run down any of that. It was to actually show the different kinds of dissonance.
No. I'm trying to say that thank you for speaking about it. Because when I go to my mother after every, online Sindhi session that we have, and I go and tell her, okay, Ajay asa he galayo se ya ho galayo se. So she immediately knows what I'm talking about.
Right.
Yeah. And her parents, of course, came from Karachi, so which I've only discovered now in past 2 years. But every time, like this morning, I told her Pahaka,
Kahavat hai,
a kahavat. And I still can't remember it, but she knew exactly what it was.
Yeah.
And all I'm trying to say is that I think as Sindhis, we need to find a way to bridge that gap between them and us. And if there's anybody else here who has a beautiful gap between mother or parent or uncle or aunt or whoever it is, try and find that. And I'm so glad you spoke about it, because it just occurred to me this morning, So thank you.
Yeah. I want to end this by saying there are also gaps, not only outside, within us, that need to be looked at. There's a section in this book called Sindhi Macracked Bowl, right? And it's basically, it says that, when I started learning the Perso-Arabic script, because I didn't go to a Sindhi school, unlike my siblings, the school shut down. All Sindhi schools have shut down. And when I started learning the Perso-Arabic script, my sister said, "Chali yahi chato khuto te." Ki tumhare ghar mein aata kam pad gaya. Like, have you run out of resources in your kitchen? Why do you want to learn such a useless language? What did it give us? Right? And nonetheless, I went on to learn the script, because that's not what I had studied and so on. But I think I want to say that there is a different, we need to see our relationships with our languages and reflect on them before those gaps are to be filled outside. We need to see where do we stand with it? How much are we able to connect with it, use it, and so on. And I think so I felt my Sindhi, my childhood, all of that collapsing together had made me into a slightly damaged sort of a person in that respect. And I remember saying to somebody that, I don't know where one goes from. And she said, but Rita, in Japan, they use cracked bowls to hold nuts, almonds together. And it is a thing of beauty. To recognize that you are both cracked, but you can also hold beauty, is to recognize that is what life is about. That it can hold both things. And I think we need to recognize that what has been the relationship with that language and whether there is a crack there. But even if there is, allow it to hold beauty now in the form of something or the other. Yeah. Thank you very much.